The royal palace was a place of great beauty, history, and culture. Visitors from all around the world came to see it, admiring its grandeur and the stories it held within its walls. But what really caught everyone's eye were the royal guards, standing tall and silent, always alert, always disciplined. These guards were more than just soldiers. They were a living symbol of the country's proud heritage, with their bright uniforms and stern expressions. Every movement they made was part of a ritual passed down through generations, showing respect for the palace, the royal family, and the people. Among the many tourists who visited the palace that day was a young traveler, full of excitement and curiosity. She had heard a lot about the royal guards, but never truly understood their significance. To her, they were just part of the scenery, part of the reason she had traveled so far to witness something new. She had seen them in pictures before, standing like statues, motionless in the sun, never blinking, never moving. But she had never seen them up close. As she stepped onto the palace grounds, she marveled at the impressive architecture and the way the guards stood so perfectly still. She couldn't help but notice their strong postures, their sharp uniforms, and the serious expressions on their faces. It all seemed so captivating, so powerful. Without really thinking, she decided she had to get a closer look. She was determined to see if these guards were really as unyielding as they appeared. Eager to take a photograph to remember the moment, she got closer to one of the guards. Her camera in hand, she clicked a photo. The flash briefly illuminated the quiet scene, but the guard did not even blink. It was as if he hadn't noticed her at all. She smiled, feeling a sense of achievement, but she couldn't help feeling a bit curious. She wanted to see just how close she could get to these guards without them reacting. After all, they were just standing there, right? It seemed harmless enough. The guard didn't react, but there was something about his stillness that made the young traveler feel both intrigued and uneasy. It was like there was an invisible boundary that she had crossed, one that she didn't fully understand. But instead of stepping back, she moved a little closer, trying to take another photo. This time, she even asked him a question. Something playful, something that she thought might make him smile. "Do you ever get tired of standing like that?" she asked, expecting nothing but silence in return. But the guard didn't respond. He remained as motionless as before, his eyes focused ahead, his stance never faltering. At first, the traveler thought he hadn't heard her. She chuckled and tried again, this time raising her voice slightly. She waved her hand in front of his face, but still, no reaction. The guard was unshakable. She paused, wondering if maybe she had misjudged the situation. Was there something more to this than just standing still? She felt a little embarrassed now, but her curiosity kept her standing there, watching him, waiting for a sign of any sort. But the guard remained silent and still, his presence commanding respect, his silence speaking volumes about the duty he held. The traveler had no idea yet, but this was only the beginning of an encounter that would teach her a valuable lesson about respect, tradition, and the importance of understanding the role these guards played in the heart of the royal palace. The young traveler was starting to feel a little uneasy. She had always heard about how serious the royal guards were, but standing so close to one, she couldn't help but wonder if she had crossed a line. She had taken a few pictures, waved her hand in front of him, and even spoken to him, but nothing had worked. The guard didn't show any sign of acknowledging her presence. He was standing there, perfectly still, with his eyes focused straight ahead, unwavering in his dedication. Feeling slightly embarrassed but still intrigued, the traveler decided to try one more thing. This time, she moved even closer to the guard. She was determined to get a response, to see if he would react in any way. She had heard stories about how some tourists tried to get a smile or a laugh out of the guards, thinking that they were like statues with no emotions. But this was no statue. This was a real person, deeply committed to the traditions and responsibilities that came with being a royal guard. The traveler, thinking maybe a more playful approach would work, asked, "Don't you ever want to move, just a little bit?" She chuckled to herself, thinking it might break the tension. But again, the guard didn't respond. No smile, no glance, nothing. He remained as unmoving as ever. It felt almost like he was unapproachable, an untouchable figure. For a moment, the traveler paused, considering her next move. Was it possible that she was pushing things too far? But the thrill of the moment, combined with her growing curiosity, kept her standing there. As she looked around, she noticed a few other tourists who were also watching the scene unfold, some with their phones out, others whispering among themselves. The traveler couldn't help but feel the eyes of the crowd on her. It made her wonder if anyone else had tried what she was doing. Perhaps they, too, had come to see how long it would take for the guard to break. But as the minutes ticked by, nothing changed. The guard didn't even flinch. His disciplined posture remained unchanged, as if he were part of the palace itself. At that moment, the young traveler started to realize that this wasn't just about getting a photo or a funny moment. The guard's silence, his stillness, seemed to carry a sense of responsibility, a deeper meaning that she had not understood before. As she stood there, she felt a growing respect for the guard. There was something almost noble in his dedication, something that transcended her initial curiosity. He wasn't there for entertainment or to please the tourists. He was there because it was his duty to stand watch over the palace, to protect its history and legacy. The traveler's playful attitude began to shift as she realized just how serious the role of the royal guard really was. Yet, despite her newfound understanding, she couldn't shake off the feeling that she was missing something. Why was he so still? Was there more to this than just tradition? Why didn't he speak? As her thoughts swirled, the young traveler took a step back, deciding that perhaps it was time to give the guard some space. But little did she know, this was only the beginning of an encounter that would teach her more about respect, boundaries, and the responsibility that came with such a role. The traveler took a step back, her curiosity still bubbling inside her. She had learned a little about the royal guards, but there was so much more to them than she realized. She watched as the guard continued standing perfectly still, his posture unwavering, his gaze fixed straight ahead. It was as if he were part of the palace itself, a living statue, standing guard over its history and traditions. For a moment, the young traveler just observed, feeling the weight of her earlier actions and wondering what had driven her to act the way she did. Other tourists around her were taking pictures, snapping shots of the royal guard, and admiring his presence, but none of them were as close as she had been. They seemed to respect the boundaries without thinking twice, focusing on the beauty of the palace and the impressive discipline of the guard. The traveler began to realize how out of place she had felt in her attempts to get the guard to interact with her. She had been so focused on getting a response, on seeing if he would break his stance, that she hadn't thought about what it meant to be in his shoes. As she looked around, she saw a few others giving the guard respectful nods or taking photos from a safe distance, but no one was trying to get too close. It made the traveler wonder, had she misunderstood the role of the royal guards entirely? She had always thought of them as silent figures, standing there for show, perhaps even hoping for some kind of amusement from tourists. But now, standing quietly in the middle of the crowd, she was beginning to see them in a new light. These guards were more than just figures of interest. They were symbols of pride, responsibility, and the unwavering protection of something much bigger than themselves. Feeling a bit ashamed of her earlier attempts, the traveler decided to walk around the area and observe the guards from a distance. She noticed how everyone around her, tourists and locals alike, seemed to move with a sense of respect. People made sure not to approach too closely, not to interfere with the guards' duties. It was clear that they understood what she had not fully grasped. The royal guard's job was not just about standing still. It was about honoring a long-standing tradition, a sense of duty to something sacred. The traveler began to realize that the guards were there to ensure the safety and dignity of the royal family and their country, and that responsibility was something far beyond the trivial distractions of a tourist. As she watched the other tourists, she noticed that many of them, like her earlier, were trying to get the perfect picture. Some took a few quick snaps before moving on, while others paused to admire the guard's poise. There was a shift in the air as the young traveler realized that perhaps the guard wasn't there to entertain anyone. He was there to fulfill a role, to remain composed and focused no matter the distractions around him. She felt a sense of respect grow within her for the discipline that the guards showed, and for their ability to maintain their composure in such a chaotic environment filled with tourists. The more she thought about it, the more the traveler understood that she had underestimated the seriousness of the guard's position. She had been so caught up in her own curiosity, her own need for attention, that she hadn't stopped to think about how her actions might affect him or how much responsibility he carried. With a soft sigh, she realized that the best way to appreciate the royal guards was to simply respect their presence and their duty. The young traveler stood there, reflecting on the situation, when something unexpected happened. As she continued to observe the royal guard, she began to feel the weight of the moment. She had been so focused on getting a reaction from him. But now it seemed like the real lesson was in his silence. He wasn't just standing still for show. He was standing for something much more important. The guard wasn't there to amuse tourists or to pose for photos. He was a symbol of something much bigger: respect for tradition, for the royal family, and for his country. Her thoughts were interrupted when a second royal guard arrived, taking his place next to the first one. This new guard was just as disciplined, his stance just as firm. The traveler watched as he stood in perfect formation beside his fellow guard, both of them unmoving, unshakable. She felt a bit of nervousness rise in her chest, realizing that her earlier curiosity had gone too far. She had been so caught up in her own excitement that she hadn't fully respected the boundaries of the situation. It didn't take long for the new guard to notice her standing too close. With a glance, he subtly stepped forward, positioning himself between her and the first guard. The young traveler immediately understood. This was a clear signal, a non-verbal message that her actions were crossing a line. The second guard wasn't aggressive, but there was a sense of firmness in his movement. It wasn't a warning in words, but it was clear enough. She had been too intrusive, and the guard was simply doing his job to maintain the order and dignity of the royal palace. A wave of embarrassment washed over the traveler. She had thought of the guards as untouchable, statuesque figures, but now she understood that they were there for a reason far beyond aesthetics. They were protectors, holding a space that demanded respect. She felt a bit foolish, realizing how her actions had not only been disrespectful to the guards, but to the history and tradition they stood for. She quickly took a step back, grateful for the guards' quiet, yet firm, correction. The crowd around her seemed to notice the shift in the atmosphere, some of them glancing at the traveler with knowing looks. A few whispered to each other, perhaps aware that she had crossed a boundary. But they didn't judge her. Instead, they seemed to respect the guard's actions, as if they too understood the importance of what had just happened. The young traveler didn't know it, but she had just learned a valuable lesson in respect and the importance of understanding cultural boundaries. For a moment, she watched the two guards stand side by side. As still as ever, their eyes locked straight ahead. Their unity was impressive, their presence commanding. The traveler realized how easy it was to forget that these men were not there for entertainment. They were upholding something much larger than any of them, something that required discipline, focus, and respect. As the realization settled in, the young traveler gave the guards a respectful nod and slowly moved away, deciding that she had learned enough for today. The experience had been eye-opening, and she now understood that the guard's stoic demeanor wasn't just about standing still, it was about upholding a tradition, a sense of responsibility that she had only begun to grasp. As she walked away, she felt a deeper appreciation for the guards and the important role they played in the royal palace. This was a moment of reflection for her, one that would stay with her long after she left the palace grounds. The traveler walked away from the royal guards, feeling a mix of embarrassment and admiration. She had come to see the palace and its legendary protectors, but now she saw them in a completely different light. As she continued to wander through the palace grounds, her thoughts kept drifting back to the guards. Their composure, their discipline. It was as though they had become a part of the palace itself, blending into the history and culture of the place. While many tourists continued to take pictures and admire the grandeur of the palace, the young traveler felt a quiet shift inside herself. She understood now that the guards weren't simply standing there as part of the scenery. They were an integral part of the palace, a living testament to the country's traditions and values. It wasn't just about tradition for the sake of tradition. It was about preserving something far more meaningful. As the traveler looked around, she noticed that the other tourists were being more careful. No one was getting too close to the guards now. They respected the unspoken boundaries that had been set. The young traveler realized that her own actions had unwittingly disturbed that balance, and she felt the weight of that. She could see the guards were not trying to draw attention to themselves, but instead they were silently teaching those around them to respect the boundaries of the place they were sworn to protect. Her walk took her to a nearby bench, where she sat down, taking a moment to reflect. There were so many things she had missed before. The quiet strength in the guards' eyes, the way they stood as though nothing could move them, no matter how many tourists passed by. They had a presence, a strength that couldn't be ignored. It wasn't the kind of strength that demanded attention or applause. It was the kind that commanded respect just by being. For the first time, the young traveler understood what the guards were really standing for. They weren't simply statues. They were protectors of something deeper. The royal family, the country's history, and the very essence of the palace were all under their watch. The guards were part of a much larger story, one that stretched back through centuries of tradition. Their silence, their stillness, wasn't about being distant or unapproachable. It was about standing firm for what they had been chosen to protect. As she sat there, a thought struck her. What if the royal guards were also teaching something else? What if they were reminding visitors, like herself, that not everything needed to be questioned or understood in the moment? Perhaps the lesson was in the patience and respect required to simply observe, to learn without needing to interrupt or disrupt. The young traveler felt a newfound respect for the royal guards. She realized that sometimes the most meaningful experiences weren't the ones that were the loudest or most exciting. Sometimes the most important lessons were the quiet ones, lessons about respect, discipline, and the power of silence. She felt grateful for the experience, knowing that it had changed the way she saw not only the guards but also the world around her. As she stood up from the bench, she took one last look at the guards, standing stoically in their positions. This time, however, she wasn't looking for a reaction. Instead, she simply admired their presence. There was no need for applause, no need for acknowledgement. The lesson had already been learned. The young traveler walked away with a deeper understanding of the royal guards and the quiet dignity they carried with them, silently teaching all who came their way. The young traveler slowly made her way to the edge of the palace grounds, her thoughts still reflecting on the royal guards. She couldn't help but think about the silent lesson they had taught her. The guards were more than just figures in uniform. They were symbols of discipline, tradition, and an unwavering commitment to something much larger than themselves. She had come to the palace expecting to take some photos and enjoy the sights, but now she felt like she had learned something far more valuable, something she couldn't capture with a camera. As she walked through the gardens, she noticed that the atmosphere around the palace felt different. The tourists, once bustling and excited, now moved more thoughtfully, respecting the quiet dignity of the place. It was as if the presence of the royal guards had somehow made everyone more aware of their surroundings. The young traveler couldn't help but smile a little at this change. She realized that in her earlier actions, she had been part of the distraction, but now she felt more attuned to the palace's serenity. The guards, still standing tall and silent, had subtly created an environment of respect. It wasn't anything that had been loudly declared, but more like a quiet understanding shared among those who had been paying attention. It was like an unspoken rule had been established, not through force or anger, but through the unwavering presence of the guards themselves. They didn't need to say anything or act in any dramatic way. They simply stood there, representing the values of respect and responsibility that had been passed down through generations. The traveler thought back to when she had tried to provoke a reaction from the guard. At the time, she hadn't understood the depth of what was at stake. She had seen them as figures for entertainment, there to be admired like statues, but now she saw them as protectors of something far greater than their uniforms. The palace wasn't just a building. It was a symbol of the country's history, its royal family, and the thousands of lives that had shaped its past. The guards weren't standing there to pose for pictures. They were guarding something precious, something that deserved to be respected. As she continued to walk, the traveler passed by other groups of tourists, some of whom had clearly seen the guards' firm stance and now kept their distance. It was as though the travelers, too, had learned something from the quiet interaction. The traveler felt a little proud of herself for understanding the lesson, even if it had taken a bit of time. She had learned not just to appreciate the guards for their uniforms or the role they played in the palace, but for the integrity they upheld by simply being present, doing their job without any need for recognition. She stopped near a fountain and looked back toward the royal guards, still standing exactly as they had before. They were as motionless as ever, but somehow they seemed more alive to her now. The young traveler realized that they didn't need to speak or move to be powerful. Their presence was enough to convey the gravity of their duty, the stillness, the silence. It was a statement in itself. It was a reminder that not everything had to be loud or visible to matter. Sometimes, the quietest actions held the most meaning. With a deep breath, the traveler gave the guards one last look. This time, it wasn't with the intent of getting a photo or making them react. It was with the understanding that they weren't here for her amusement. They were here for something far more significant. And in that moment, the traveler felt grateful for the lesson, for the chance to experience something that she would carry with her long after she left the palace. She walked away, her heart lighter and her mind clearer, knowing that sometimes the greatest moments of learning come in silence. The young traveler continued to walk through the palace grounds, her thoughts still heavy with reflection. As she made her way toward the exit, she realized just how much her perspective had shifted in such a short time. What had started as a simple sightseeing adventure had turned into a deeper understanding of the traditions and customs that shaped the palace and its royal guards. She couldn't help but feel grateful for the unexpected lesson in respect and discipline. As she exited the gates of the palace, she found herself thinking back to the moment when the second guard had gently intervened. The firmness of his movement, the quiet correction, it wasn't harsh or cruel, but rather a simple reminder of the boundaries that had been set. The young traveler appreciated that. It wasn't about making her feel bad. It was about teaching her, and perhaps the others around her, the importance of respecting the space and the traditions that had been upheld for so long. The other tourists she had seen earlier were now leaving as well, some still chatting excitedly about their experience, while others walked in silence, reflecting on the solemn atmosphere. It was clear that something had changed in the air since the moment of the guard's intervention. Even the most energetic visitors seemed to have slowed down, as if they too had absorbed a bit of the quiet dignity that the guards exuded. The lesson wasn't just for her. It had been passed on to everyone in that space, even if it had been subtle. The young traveler found herself walking with a renewed sense of purpose. She no longer saw the guards as mere figures to be admired, but as symbols of something deeper, something that required respect. She understood now that their stoic presence wasn't just a job. It was a commitment to something much bigger, something that had endured through the years, through changes and challenges, remaining unchanged despite the world around them. Walking through the streets of the city, the traveler couldn't help but notice how different everything seemed. The simple act of walking, of observing, had taken on new meaning. The hustle and bustle of the busy streets now seemed less chaotic. The traveler realized that what had seemed like a distraction only moments before had actually been a part of the experience, an experience she hadn't truly seen until now. As she continued her walk, she reflected on how much of life was like this. So often, people rush through moments, caught up in their own world, unaware of the deeper lessons unfolding around them. But today, she had been given a rare opportunity to pause, to truly observe, and to learn. The royal guards, in their silent duty, had shown her the importance of being present, of appreciating the quiet moments, and of respecting the spaces and traditions that are often overlooked. The young traveler smiled to herself, feeling a quiet sense of peace that hadn't been there before. She knew that she would remember this day, not just for the beautiful palace or the royal guards, but for the lesson in patience, respect, and the power of silence. It was a reminder that sometimes the greatest lessons come not from grand gestures, but from the stillness and discipline that lies quietly beneath the surface. As she made her way back to her hotel, she felt a new appreciation for the world around her, knowing that she had experienced something far more meaningful than she had ever expected. As the young traveler made her way back to her hotel, she couldn't shake the feelings of reflection that had accompanied her all afternoon. She had come to see a royal palace, expecting to take pictures, enjoy the sights, and perhaps learn a little about the culture. But what she had gained that day was far more valuable than she could have imagined. The royal guards, with their stillness and their silent strength, had taught her something profound about respect, tradition, and the true meaning of presence. She had learned that not everything in life was meant to be understood immediately, and sometimes the most important lessons came when you least expected them. Earlier, her curiosity had led her to push boundaries she hadn't fully understood. She had wanted to provoke a response from the guards, to get them to break their stoic exterior. But instead, they had quietly taught her about the strength in silence, the power in standing firm. The lesson had been subtle, but it had sunk deep. The guards weren't there to entertain or to perform. They were there to protect something far greater than themselves: the history, the traditions, and the legacy of the royal palace and the nation it represented. As she walked through the streets, the traveler found herself noticing more of the small details around her, how people moved with purpose, how the world around her seemed to have its own quiet rhythm that she had never fully appreciated until now. For the first time, she realized how important it was to respect the spaces and traditions that shape the places we visit. It wasn't just about learning the history of a building or a monument. It was about understanding the people who had dedicated their lives to preserving it. The guards were more than just protectors of the palace. They were guardians of a culture, of a way of life that had endured for centuries. Their role wasn't just to stand still. It was to remind visitors like her that some things were sacred, that some traditions demanded respect and patience. The young traveler found herself reflecting on how often people rushed through life without stopping to truly understand the significance of the things around them. How many times had she herself been caught up in the excitement of a moment, only to miss its deeper meaning? Today had been a reminder that sometimes the most meaningful experiences were the quiet ones, the ones that ask you to slow down and pay attention. She thought back to the moment when the second guard had subtly intervened, guiding her away from her closer approach. At the time, she had felt embarrassed, even a little frustrated. But now she saw it for what it truly was: a gentle but firm reminder of the respect that was due to both the guards and the traditions they upheld. There was no anger in his action, only a sense of duty and quiet authority. By the time she reached her hotel, the traveler felt like a different person. She had learned that respect wasn't always about grand gestures or obvious signs. Sometimes it was about understanding the silent strength of a moment, about appreciating the things that weren't immediately visible but had been carefully woven into the fabric of a place or tradition over time. As she lay in bed that night, the traveler reflected on how much she had learned in just one day. She had expected to experience a palace, but instead, she had encountered something far more meaningful: a lesson in patience, presence, and respect for the quiet strength that exists all around us. And as she drifted off to sleep, she felt a sense of gratitude for the guards, for the palace, and for the lesson that would stay with her for years to come.